We just want to say a few words about the settlement plan. We've already alluded to that in the morning. It's something that we take quite seriously at ICA. Some of the longer-standing sponsorship agreement holder organizations don't have to submit these pieces to the Canadian government. As a consequence, just sort of anecdotally, it seems that they are not actually doing them up necessarily. Technically, they're supposed to keep them on file, even though they don't submit them to the government. I'm actually glad that we have to submit them to the government because it forces us to think about that stuff in advance. So apart from this form, which is sort of minimalistic, but it has this important piece about housing in it and temporary housing that we talked about this morning, and something that I would never ever let go out without having some careful conversations around this. We also attach an actual budget, which we do up as an Excel sheet. I've said already this morning, I prepare this as a draft, I give it to the group, and then we talk about it and we change it to suit particular needs. And then there is a list of all the constituent group members attached. That is also a requirement by the government with your contact info. I prepare all of that because I have this information from your criminal record check applications. And what I ask you to do as a group at that point is to think about how you're going to split out the responsibilities. And certainly, you know, if you later on need to change that, if one person said, I'll be dealing with furniture, and the other person says, I'll be looking for a housing, and then you switch that up, that is fine. But, you know, we want to make sure that you have given careful thought to how are you going to cover all of the things that need to be done. And it's only one person from your group that will sign the actual documents that go forward to the Canadian government. We don't need like all of you to sign those documents. So that's also important that you early on decide who's going to be that person. Generally speaking, it's the leader of the group, the person who has served the function of liaising with us and sort of pulling the group together. So we've talked about budgeting and that it's an iterative process. We've talked about that we need to revisit the budget several times, so we don't need to go into those discussions again. Handing over the budget control to the newcomers as early as possible is important, keeping in mind, you know, their ability to actually budget. So you need to sit down with them with an interpreter and have that conversation about budgets. If you take them out shopping early on, they will very soon understand what the costs are and what money is worth. So this is an important piece, but we want to be able to give them full control to release the funds into their accounts as soon as possible. We've talked about changes to the budget, that we will need to talk about that we should have meetings every so often as issues arise and talk about these. And basically, for the most part, any payments made by you on behalf of newcomers and getting reimbursements will, for the most part, stop by the time money gets put into their accounts. So with that in mind, I know that everybody has eaten now and you have, you're using your blood for digestion. We want to get it back in our brains. Yes, yeah.
The budget. Yeah. And so in our group, one of the things that we've talked about is, well, we fundraised and we have a money in addition, like kind of a buffer, so that we're not feeling confident that if something happens, we have additional monies. What's your recommendation about like how we integrate that buffer into the budget? Do we make that known to the family? Do we just keep that somewhere else, or what's the best way to proceed around having a buffer?
So we always have a bit of a budget line that is for contingency, you know, and unforeseen circumstances. That is a monthly amount, $100 usually, maybe $200. That's sort of the maximum, and that we will pay out into the account. If you're talking about, you know, having fundraised an extra $30,000, that's a different story, obviously. So unless there are very special circumstances where let's say there was some very rare, illness, and the people needed drugs that are not on the formulary. An expensive drugs are needed, like those kinds of circumstances. Otherwise, no, we wouldn't just be adding those funds. They would then, sit in your account at the end of the sponsorship period, and we would make them available for other sponsorships.
Okay, so additional monies then can sit in that account for an indefinite period, and then we can decide later, because in our case we do have.
Yeah, well, not for an indefinite period. I mean, at the end of the 1-year sponsorship period, for your case, we will close down that account. So at that point in time, we will decide what we do with these funds that are left over. Okay? So, what I want you to do is I want you to work a little bit. So I'm going to hand out a simple case scenario. So for the purpose of recording, that case scenario can be incorporated later on in the webcast, and people can work by themselves through the case scenario. But what we're doing here is we're working at our tables in groups, okay? So just one per table, yeah. So basically, this is a typical case, something that can happen. And read through it and take 10 minutes or so at your table to discuss this. Then we won't have time to hear back from everybody, but maybe we can hear from some of the tables as to what their reaction is. Was there consensus at the table? Did people have different opinions about the case? And so on and so forth. Let's hear from some of the tables what was going on at the table regarding the case of the Smith family. So, does anybody want to throw something out in terms of the discussions that were going on? Yes. Can we listen to the table?
We were lacking some information on this, but the thing that was most clear about the Smith family was that you should have very limited or no expectations, because you'll likely be disappointed. As a sponsorship group, as you made it clear to us, these are grown people, they've survived this long, they're capable of making their own decisions, and it's up to us to provide them the support we can. What we don't understand is what our legal liabilities are should they want to go off to Toronto. We can't stop them, we shouldn't stop them as a sponsorship group, but are we financially bound to them?
Great point. So the first point, really important, however, we heard that we lack some information here. Okay, what kind of information do we lack? Why are they moving to another city? Yeah, we don't know that. Yeah, we don't know that. Right.
Perhaps some details of their social background and the land that they came from.
Right. Okay. There's just something. So yeah, keeping that in mind to not jumping to conclusions. I don't know whether we can have no expectations. I think it is innate in our human nature that we have expectations, but it's about how we manage our own expectations, right? What we do with our own expectations. So we probably can't, we're not an empty sheet. We can't live without, we have expectations. That's just our nature. So yeah, interesting.
One of the things that we spoke about was the importance very early on about being as clear as possible, and then for our group, we think that we're going to have regular check-ins about the budget with the family, so it doesn't, their adjustments and what they want to spend money on versus what we allocated.
But they're moving to Toronto now.
Yeah,
about
and that's
Before that.
before that, from
Yeah.
early on, just to maybe not let it escalate to a place where it's fine if they're moving, and we have to go to you and find out, now what?
Okay. There's a couple of people over here. I don't know who was first. Maybe we'll just go in that order, Heather, and then down there goes.
Well, we had the benefit of Jean in our group, so we actually now know what our legal obligation is when we move to Toronto. And we don't have, once they move out of the community, right, Jean, then we no longer have a legal obligation to them. So what we felt was that, great, I mean, if that is really what you want, and then more power to you, off you go, and we will just take the rest of that money and apply it to a new family.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's legally how it is. However, in practice, the government might ask us, in such a case, whether we would be willing to continue to support for the year. We could be working with somebody in Toronto, finding somebody there in Toronto. So this is apparently, that's what the government say in practice, what might happen. So,
but we would work that out.
yeah, we would have to work it out. Yeah, absolutely. So it's not a fault, breakdown of the sponsorship, unless something happened and you did something, that all of a sudden made these people say they want to.
That would be a different
But
situation.
we don't know that. Is somebody back there? Yeah.
Just in terms of the scenario, just that we are so embedded in our own cultural expectations, and there's a necessity to constantly question those assumptions, rather, in that, if someone is from a communal society where it's customary to have people babysitting, looking after kids, taking people places, and there's not that understanding, nor do we want them necessarily to, nor do we want them to feel guilty about what's being given to them, but there may not be an understanding that this isn't the norm and it isn't an expectation that is valid in our culture. They may not know that. And so where resentment can start to build when there's this expectation and don't you know we're doing everything we can, or don't you know, those kinds of things can happen without understanding the cultural realities of each.
So you're right, and we have no idea what their expectations are. The one thing we do know is that many people that come to the BVOR stream have no idea that there's even a sponsoring group. They don't know until they step off the plane whether they are government assisted or BVOR or what this even means. So that's why we have been trying to be right there when they arrive with the use of interpreters to actually explain to them who these people are who are waiting outside for them. So that is definitely, this is where it starts, right, in terms of expectations. And whatever they think the sponsors are, we'll probably maybe find out years down the road, when they're more cultured and have a better way of expressing these issues. We might not find that out for long. There was somebody back there,
yeah, we also talked about cultural expectations, and in particular the way the question was written was kind of like in Victoria, we're told constantly we're the best place in Canada, but if you come from a very urban, very warm environment, and you aren't used to a lot of space or nature being a value that is, you might actually find Victoria a very difficult place, and sort of telling them how great it is that they're in the best city in Canada, that would be much worse if they were in the snow. Probably is a good thing to do. The other thing we talked about though is that with the language barrier, as something comes like this, to have a more depth of understanding about why they're not happy, you might want an interpreter to find out, are there some smaller things you can fix? In which case, you could, through an interpreter, say, these sort of things were taken care of. Would you still prefer to move to Toronto? And then the other thing we talked about was family dynamics. Is what if the father wants to move to Toronto, but the mom is really happy with their kids are at school or something? So that again, an interpreter would be pretty important to get those nuances before you then help them move if that's what they want.
Absolutely. It's definitely, at this point in time, if you cannot properly communicate because of linguistic barriers, it is vitally important to get an interpreter involved here to get a better sense of what's going on.
On that end, it seemed that one of the things we thought in our group is that position group would all sort of think, okay, everyone's got responsibilities. One guy drives on Wednesday. But if a family's having a complex issue you've got cross-cultural, it seems to be that there's got to be somebody in the group that actually they're not dependent on for, can have a hard conversation. Because you're going to have them, you just don't know when you're going to have them, you don't know what it's going to be about, but they're going to be coming. So it's almost like you've got to have people in your own group to say, when these unknown situations arise, who do we have in our group that could do this so they don't feel they're going to lose the ride on Wednesday or that other thing, because then you've got a really weird power relationship happening and other stuff. So how do you handle that at a practical level, or is that just worrying? Your great article at the beginning was, don't worry, the next step will reveal itself. Well, maybe not.
I think what this was all about was that you can do all the preparation in the world you want. You probably, most people wouldn't prepare, for example, for this scenario. I haven't heard many people ask that question. So it's not something that's first and foremost on people's minds. So it was just to say that things happen that you have never prepared for, even if you have read, you know, copious amounts of literature and watched webinars. So that was just, yeah.
Is this an actual scenario that you know?
It's used by the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, so I'm not entirely sure whether it is real. I mean, obviously the names of the towns and all of that are not. It is definitely a scenario that happens, yes. People definitely decide to do this. People also decide at the end of the sponsorship period to do this, when obviously there's no more legal question about it, but I spoke with a person myself, like not on the island, but off island, at length, and asked, because it was a more rural community, and asked her, you know, whether they had any refugees resettled before. So she told me about a case and told me, you know, how outraged the constituent group was when this group of people decided to move away after the first year, and how, you know, they felt they were ungrateful and all of that. So apparently, even at the end of the first year, after all this time, there was a very minimal understanding. And they had a very good reason for moving, because they had found family members that were in another part of Canada. Yeah, so, just a moment.
There were just a couple of questions which argument thought that the first thing you do is to sit down with the family, with help to interpret and understand what was going on for them, what their experience was. But there were also a couple of things. I mean, it could be this scenario that was someone in the sponsorship group actually still had the lease. So there could be some complications in there. The other part is that part of our responsibility is to accompany the family through the acculturation process too. And regardless of who has responsibility for the lease, the understanding of the lease as a legal document is also a learning opportunity for the family in the process of deciding to leave and to relocate. I think it could be an experience that helpful to the family as well when they in terms of understanding how laws are.
Yeah, and on the lease, I mean, all the leases that I've seen so far, certainly with the big management companies, they all have lease breach fines, but they're not substantial. I mean, they're either half a month's rent or a month's rent. So, you know, you're just gonna have to eat it. Yeah. So I'm going to take one more comment, somebody we haven't heard from, and then we've got to move on because we have people waiting. Yes.
I'm curious if you have any experience of how a group, say a large group of 70 people, might come to an agreement of how to handle such a
See, that's a good one. That's the one for the... Yeah. So the question is, how can a large group, did you say 17 or 70? 70 people. Okay, so first of all, so the question is, how would they handle such a situation? How would they come to any consensus? I would first of all say that you have a group, if you have a group of 70, where all people have equal rights in the decision-making process, you probably will spend more time managing group dynamics than anything else. So I would basically, from the get-go, advise against that. So there is a large group, for example, here the group at the table, they're very large, but they have set themselves up in a certain way. So they have sort of an inner circle, they have 3 cases, and you know, different people are affiliated with different cases, and then they have sort of an outer circle around that. So they have found a way to set themselves up. 70 people, you know, trying to come democratically to some kind of consensus, it's not going to work, I would say.
How about 5 people? Even this table couldn't agree.
No, and you know, that's something that you need to think about early on in the process. I mean, managing your own constituent group and coming to some agreement how you want to go about making decisions. I know one group that I had various meetings with, they're quite large, and so they have kind of elected this core, like sort of the steering committee. You know, some of the groups have a steering committee that basically has the blessing to make certain decisions of minor importance, and then for big importance, questions. They are sort of going to majority vote. So people are trying to figure these things out. We don't, you know, tell groups how they should run themselves. I mean, that's basically up to the group, but I definitely 70 people is probably too big. Yeah, I would say. Yeah. So we'll leave it at that just because in the interest of time, and I need to give my throat a little break here. So essentially the last slide here is to say, again, there are truckloads of resources available, and you will get resources, you will get more resources than you can absorb. You can take the 10-week RSTP training. It is an online training program. It does run on Moodle, so an online platform. You can self-enroll. I mean, there's more things you can do than you have time for. That's really not the issue, and don't get overwhelmed with that. You know, keep that advice in mind about there's so much we can do to prepare, and then the rest of it will just have to flow as it comes, and we'll deal with it as it comes.